Greetings. This is another one of our chats about inclusive education, and this is a series of chats we're having with people doing interesting things to promote inclusive education in Canadian schools. I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and my colleagues today are Diane Richler, who's a former Executive Vice President of the Canadian Association for Community Living, now called Inclusion Canada, and active globally on inclusive education issues with Inclusion International, and Jackie Speck, who's a professor in the Faculty of Education at Western University in London and the chair of the Canadian Research Centre on Inclusive Education. Our guest this afternoon is Marilyn Dolmage, who's a parent, consultant, activist with inclusive education, and has been for a number of years. Marilyn's worked with families, with schools, with school districts, and her position has always been to build competence by parents to work with schools to make inclusion a reality. And we're very pleased to have her with us here for this chat. And Marilyn, why don't you just tell us briefly what leads you to continue to be an advocate for inclusive education at this point in time?
Well, that's a big question and a lot of years to sort of digest and think of where we are now. But I still see that families are struggling, have a big struggle to make sure that their sons and daughters are supported to learn as members of regular classrooms in their neighborhood schools. Even, I say all those words because I think even the definition of inclusive education is misunderstood, maybe even more now than when I began as a parent back in the 80s. And when I worked as a consultant across Ontario, starting in the 1990s. But my interest in this goes even further back and on a much bigger level at all the forms of segregation of disabled people, all the forms of ableism. And I connect that. I do work in other areas, and I see the links with inclusive education around direct funding for people to have their own lives. I've worked to close government institutions. I've worked to support survivors of those institutions to take action against the government and win an apology and some compensation. But all those issues are tied to me in stopping the harm of segregation and opening up the wonderful possibilities of inclusive education that people have to hear about.
So there are many people that I think are focused on inclusion in life in the community for people when they leave school. But there seems to be a dichotomy that they perhaps don't quite capture the idea that inclusion in school is a really important factor in bringing the second inclusion about. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that? What's your experience with that issue?
Well, I think it'll be continuously hard for people to live inclusive lives in the community if they haven't had an inclusive education. And, I still have hope and faith that people can live good lives at any point in their life and they can be assisted with that. After all, I've closed government institutions and tried to put pieces back together and connections back together for people who've lost them for many, many years. But the really best way to do that, and not just for disabled children, but for all children, is to have them learning together in school so that there isn't that us and them idea, that othering that's so harmful that we have to, it's kind of there's that tide of or current of segregation. It's hard to work against it, better to stop it, right? For children and for young children, I'd say it starts at birth or diagnosis, with a positive attitude and supports in their lives, networks and community. But it's especially important for preschools.
What do you think gives parents the confidence to, or the vision to seek inclusion from when their kids are first identified as having a disability or very early in their lives?
Well, the sad thing really is that it's often a negative experience that starts that. It's often a sense of what they don't want. And I think those who've not experienced that may even find it hard to imagine the negative messages and experiences that people still have, parents, families still have when a child is born or diagnosed with a disability. So people, in my experience, first know what they don't want. And sometimes they learn that in really hard ways, as my family did, in fact. But we're connected then with people who know that the alternative is possible and know how to make it happen. So it starts, I think, with a nightmare, with something we want to avoid. I would rather it didn't, but that's where we are as a society. And it's really important to substitute that with a dream, with the focus of a better future, a better way of describing our sons and daughters and introducing them to school and neighborhood in terms of their strengths and interests and all the things they can contribute. But we don't learn that when kids are diagnosed. We have to unlearn those negative messages.
Jackie?
Yeah, I was intrigued when you were introducing yourself, Marilyn. You said that the definition of inclusion or inclusive education is more misunderstood now than when you started. How so? And you know, what is your definition of inclusive education, and what do you see as that misunderstanding?
Well, it's a long discussion. I think when I became the project coordinator for the Building Inclusive Schools project in Ontario, that was the first thing we wanted to do, was establish a strong definition. So we mean support for a student to learn better, and that means support for the teacher to teach better, whatever it takes. It means the highest possible individualized academic and social expectations. It means a sense of belonging in your class, which means the teacher has to be committed to your success. That mutuality is there. To me, it always means neighborhood school, and it always means brothers and sisters with you. That was the first movement our family made, that we had to stop our son Matthew from living a life separate from his brother and sister. And a sense of contribution to the classroom and participation in the classroom and the school and the broader community. So I've also found a set of criteria for inclusive education that was developed by the University of New Hampshire really helpful to sort of go, the way I say it is, it's like inclusion is a richly woven blanket, and we have to pay attention to all the threads to make sure that it is just as warm and just as beautiful for everyone. And we're not missing some of those, the fine threads that are important to the sense of belonging. I would say your second part of your question about how that's changed, I think, well, when we started, we talked about integration, and for our family, and there was a group in Ontario called Integration Action Group, and that name changed to Integration Action for Inclusion, which is a little bit awkward, but we were the collective that was formed around Integration Action was the Coalition for Inclusive Education, and we were using the word inclusion when the ministry was not, and when most schools were not. When we started to see schools and ministry using that word, they unfortunately often kept ability grouping out of the equation. And we're talking about other important aspects of inclusion, racial issues and socioeconomic issues, and particularly the pedagogy of inclusion. But unfortunately, what we see is sometimes schools and school districts and agencies and government use the word inclusion while not considering students with disabilities to be members of schools. What else? Oh, another thing is, what does that support to learn or support to teach equal? And I think what I've seen over time is a lot more emphasis on there having to be extra staffing, particular educational assistants. And that can sometimes go very badly wrong. It can actually segregate kids. And there was another thing I was thinking about. Well, I guess leaving out the social, not being clear that it's both social and academic. Maybe that's the best way to sum that up.
I'm just thinking about some of the things that you've been involved in, and one has been focusing on school leaving, both in terms of what students are learning in high school and then moving forward. And I think for all parents, it's often very hard to think about the future when your children are young and still in primary and elementary school. What kinds of messages do you think families need to hear, and what's the best way of delivering those for people to think in the long term, to think about where their children are in the early years is going to help them to or hinder them as they grow older?
Well, the odd and unfortunate thing is that when kids are diagnosed, the professionals in families' lives often do jump to the future and make really negative predictions about the future. So again, it's that turning around that negative nightmare picture to a dream picture. And in the work I've done and for my own family, I think the most powerful help we had was through a very independent voice of People First of Ontario, in our case, but the self-advocate voice that's very independent of service provision is really important. And in those days, they had a sort of motto, real school, real jobs, real pay, real home. And we talked about real friends and real love. And when we heard the stories of people, both the juxtaposition of the really horrible stories of segregation, which I've heard in spades from institution survivors and families and their families, but to juxtapose that with this hope that a better future could happen and some stories of how it did happen. So for our son Matthew, for example, he left school, had his own direct funding, had employment, made a contribution, had connections. It wasn't perfect, but I think telling those stories of change really helps people imagine and take it even further the next time. But so, it's summed up in that real, what's real, as opposed to this phony idea that some people get real lives and others get their lives controlled by others. So even things like we talked, over the years, we've talked about person-centered planning and person-directed planning, but the language I think has to change to challenge a little bit more about person power, that people would really have control over their own lives and their own futures. And that's a process for all families. Usually our kids kind of challenge us in that way. And unfortunately, well, there was a project that now Inclusion Canada led that I was the coordinator for around what happens to students with intellectual disabilities when they leave high school, what happens as they enter adult life. And we started out using the word transition, and everybody involved said, no, throw that word out, talk about employment and career development and employment, but don't settle for this transition. Again, not a bad word, but it ends up being which program can we slot you in and where's the funding? A very narrow way of looking at anybody's future. So thinking about, looking ahead to a real life, what you need a real high school life for that to happen. You need academic learning, and families need to have that sort of long-term vision, I think, in order to sustain them through some of the struggles that exist.
So I've often come across governments who are using as an argument to maintain segregation that this is what parents are asking for. I'm interested in hearing your reflection on that. And I don't dispute the fact that many parents end up asking for segregation, but I think there are a lot of reasons for that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, again, power, parents don't have power over those decisions. Um, it's very difficult to assert yourself in a meeting with a whole lot of professionals who are stuck in the old picture. And so one of the things that that system tells parents is that only some kids can be included, only those with the most skills. So then that puts pressure on parents to get their kids involved in therapy kinds of programs that they could be less disabled. We need to debunk that whole idea. We need to really encourage parents. It does mean everybody. And therapy works against those goals. Therapy takes you back into that old picture of, you know, going somewhere else to get changed. Also, parents are easily led to believe that their children will be more vulnerable in a regular classroom. That's ignoring the realities of institutions and segregation and harm, huge harm that happens when people are isolated. But they're led to believe that there needs to be an adult with them all the time. And that takes us away from the true definition of inclusion. But so the law where I live is that regular class placement should happen where it is what the parents want and where it meets the students' needs. Well, the fact is that education professionals have a huge power to shape parents' perceptions of what is possible or what their child can do, and also make all the decisions around what the students' needs are and how they can be accommodated. So parents have to be helped to define their sons and daughters' needs in inclusive ways and to focus on the strengths that they have and build the connections so that they can resist that professional control that just takes us all back to the old special ed system. I think also, I know when I first encountered the school system as a parent, I hadn't been in school for a long time, although my husband was a high school teacher. And I wasn't thinking about grade 1, kindergarten even, as an active learning place. I was remembering that, you know, everybody will lockstep sort of learning thing that I had experienced with not a happy experience. And I couldn't imagine how Matthew would fit in. But what I think really helps, and we have more potential now to understand schools as active learning places, that's the best education for all kids. And that sometimes having a student who requires some particular accommodations can help a teacher develop sort of universal design for learning. And most parents don't know anything about that. So they're easily pushed away, even for little kids, away from thinking that the school cannot accommodate them or will not. Will not is a bigger problem. Cannot, I think, is important to dispel. And that students don't need to reach some prerequisite level of skills to be a member of the regular classroom or the family or the community. And so we could talk about that for a long time.
So Marilyn, given the situation, let's just talk about your own province of Ontario. What do you think can be done to support parents to have this vision for their children to be included in school when they start into the system much more significantly than they are now, and to kind of tamp down this influence the system has to say, well, this special program is really where we can serve your child best? Like, how do we build up the confidence of parents that inclusion is the path forward for their child?
Well, we have to support them with a lot of courage and commitment and consistency right from day one, all the way through people's lives. We have to share those stories of what has worked for others, because sometimes it's just a little glimmer of hope that keeps you going. As I say, when I was doing this project, the Building Inclusive Schools project around Ontario, every community I went to, I'd always ask what was happening for little kids. And in those days, in the 90s, even in the 70s, when my children were preschoolers, we were developing inclusive preschool support. And if we don't have inclusive preschools, we're not going to have inclusive schools. You know, we have to start really early. But, and that means, you know, those advocates who are concerned about the lives of adults and those providing services for adults who actually want change to happen need to reach down to school-age, high school, elementary school, preschool, back to early childhood, and really be there for families, whatever it takes. So sharing a vision, helping families reach a more positive vision. And I've been thinking a lot about that because I'm writing a book about some of my professional and personal experiences. And that starts with just adoring babies. You know, it's having neighbors who welcome you home from an appointment or from a birth, saying we're here and we love this baby just like all other babies. And that you know, moves me to tears, because that's what we should expect. And then whatever our community is, we don't want any families to feel isolated for any reason. Everyone should have a network of support. We need to build that for people, but we need to be there for them, attending school meetings with them, finding them resources. We need to give parents enough information so that they're not totally intimidated when they enter into a school meeting. And they need people with them who will speak on their behalf when they're too sad or too upset to know what to do next.
But how do we institutionalize this? Like, some would argue that this needs to come from policies or laws of the ministry or a school board. Or others would argue that we need to do what Jackie does, which is to train new people becoming teachers to have the knowledge and skills to do it. And then some people think it's up to the parents. The parents have to be given the tools in order to insist that this happens. But it can't be one-off you know, Marilyn in Ontario and Gordon in New Brunswick and somebody in Alberta. That doesn't seem to have done the job in the last couple of decades. Mm-hmm. So where do you see the most likely progress that we can make? Or is there progress to be made?
I think it's all of those things. But maybe we need to strengthen the network of all of those things so that we talk more to each other. So, I mean, I feel very fortunate that I've known about Jackie's work, and we've worked together on some projects, and we could bring some tools to tell the story of what can happen in inclusive high school, for example. But we need to make sure people are getting those. And, you know, honestly, when I look back and I feel discouraged, because I think in lots of ways things are worse around families' ability to navigate the system and the alternate messages they're getting. But we do have information to share. So it has to be coordinated, and we have to get away from this idea that, well, families have chosen segregation, it must be okay. Because as a society, it's not okay. I mean, institutions took people away from their families, they isolated them and harmed them horribly, but they harmed society too, because we lost those people for all those years, and we tolerated that harm and those disappearances. So we have to support the strengths that are out there, and I'm all about that. So when I talk about focusing on student strengths, I want to focus on teacher strengths too, and school system strengths, and really build on them. But you have to not sacrifice strong families to the oppressive system. If we lose the strong families, to the pressure, we're never going to make progress. So we really have to, tell the positive stories and keep the motivated families resourced and encouraged.
So in your role as advocate, Marilyn, I mean, obviously by the time somebody might need to bring you in, things are not going so well, but can you see, has there been a change? Are there some positive messages that we can learn to create this collaborative system moving forward?
Well, the families that do get support and do have that vision and get some support to stay with it, even in systems that do a lot of segregation, have managed to have some inclusion happen for their children. I think we have to look a little farther to find schools and school systems that are really on board. And we have to keep them honest. We have to keep telling the stories and having people visit them. In Ontario, for many years, we had 3 school boards that were openly inclusive, and they kind of got weaker and not as strong. But the Hamilton Wentworth Catholic Board, when I was working around the province more, they were always open to having visitors come. And I think that is what keeps schools, let's call it, honest. When visitors come and ask the hard questions. I remember visiting a high school where, I walked through the cafeteria and I could see that the students with disabilities were clustered. And I was able to right away say, what was that? And people took those questions to heart. So it's openness to challenge and to, I think we can't afford to lose some strong players and some good examples and role models, whether it's families or agencies or educators or teacher educators or anybody. We need to keep us all supported in a network so that we can support each other. And so even though I've worked at this for so long and I see a lot of problems still, I still have faith that the system can change. That's what keeps me going.
Well, clearly you'd have to be an optimist or you would have given up a long time ago. But and I often think that, looking at what's happening for kids across the country and around the world, that we can paint 2 different pictures. We can look at the glass being half empty and all the things we still have to do. We can look at it as being half full and all the good things that exist. And I remember, like you do, when there were 3 systems in Ontario, and those were the 3 that we took people to and the 3 directors of education that we could count on. What I've loved about the chats that we've been having about inclusion is that clearly there are some fantastic examples everywhere across the country. Like really, there's so much going on, so much richness, but it seems far from a tipping point. And the thing that I haven't heard a lot is what you're talking about in terms of parent leadership. The Integration Action Group got under a lot of people's skin, but it sure had an impact. And I don't get the sense that there are that there's as strong a movement getting under the skin of some of the large school boards, or certainly under the skin of ministry officials. Mm-hmm. Any last thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think getting under the skin is a hard thing, and it's hard to be painted as the antagonistic person, and sometimes I only get pulled in to be the bad cop, and I don't like that, but I also can talk about all the positives. I think what's really, really essential is that we support the families, but we support them in a collective way at the school board level. And then we learn from the issues that families and school boards are facing, and we take that to the provincial level where decisions are made. So we did that back in the late 1990s. We had that opportunity. We had youth were part of the message, and self-advocates who themselves had experienced segregation, often in institutions. And sometimes that was the most powerful combination, that teachers sat back and watched those people, not just what they said, but how they were relating to each other and how they were crediting each other, and all the mutual learning that was going on. But we can't leave it up to families, because so we've got the tools. We've been the big struggle is to get people to pick them up and use them. But we have the tools, that's fabulous. We didn't have them back, 30, 40 years ago. We do know them now. And so we have to increase the motivation. And sometimes that comes from being the bad cop at a meeting, or by challenging a system that refuses to support children and just continues to support the segregation of adults, and wonder, why isn't anything changing? Or the people who use inclusion far too loosely and don't mean everybody. And when we actually were involved in a legal action for our son, we got the message that he was the wrong kid to advocate for. Well, sorry, he was our kid and his life depended on it. And we needed people there to help us. And that made all the difference.
I think talking about the tools are there is a good place to conclude our chat, Marilyn. You've demonstrated in the past a significant contribution and commitment to inclusion in schools, and there's lots more to be done, so there's lots more for you to do. Thank you for being with us, and thank you to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.